Good morning, students. Today is Monday, 7 February 2022. Remember what I told you in my email. I will be in class tomorrow morning at 8 on Tuesday morning, the 8th of February. I will be in class, but because I'm still recording videos for you and posting them on Canvas, I will not be lecturing tomorrow morning. Now, if you want to come to class tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock, that's up to you. But don't come expecting me to lecture. I'm doing my lecture right now. What I'll be doing instead is preparing for my upcoming ethics course at 11 o'clock. So the university is requiring that I be on campus, but because of a special situation involving one or more students who need legal accommodations, I'm going to be posting videos until the 1st of March. On the 1st of March, I will be lecturing live in the classroom and there will be no more videos. So just bear with me for about 3 more weeks, just a few more videos, and then classes will be live in the classroom. Okay? Now the exam is 10 days from today. The exam is scheduled for the 17th of February. Today is the 7th, so 10 days. It's a week. It's 2 weeks from this coming Thursday. Okay? I'm sorry, 1 week. 1 week from this coming Thursday, 10 days from now. And on that day, the 17th of February, you will go into Canvas. The exam starts at 8 o'clock sharp and it runs for 75 minutes. So you must take the exam during that 75-minute period. So get that on your calendar. Make sure nothing comes up to interfere with it. Okay, I've posted a number of items for you. Several of them are optional reading. They're readings that have to do with the legal status of animals or perhaps the moral status of animals. So again, they're optional. Whenever you see the phrase optional reading, that tells you that you may read it, but you don't have to. It's discretionary. And that means I won't test you on it. So feel free to read them if you'd like. I've also posted my lecture notes for the essay that we're beginning today by Stephen Wise. So here is my copy of his article. It's a little bit long, but you've probably noticed that much of it is taken up by footnotes. So what you might want to do is read it through while skipping the footnotes, at least the first time you read it. And then, if you have time, go through and read it again more slowly and carefully, and this time read the footnotes. Some of the footnotes contain useful information or qualifications to his argument. So again, if you want, you can read it through the first time while skipping the footnotes. Okay, so those are the postings. You may also have noticed that I posted already what I call a sampling of examination questions. Now, I mentioned this on the first day of class. I'm going to do this only for the first exam, not for the second and not for the third. The purpose of these sample questions is to show you the kind of questions that I will have on my exam 10 days from now. It's to relieve or alleviate some of your anxiety. Now, some of the questions that are on the sample questions, maybe many of them, maybe even all of them, will appear in the exam. So it's in your interest to study the sample questions carefully and at least remember the answers. And I won't tinker with anything. If a question appears on the sample questions and I also put it on the exam, it will be worded the same way. I won't change the wording or anything like that. So again, if you remember the answers and if they show up on the exam, in effect, you're getting free points. But I won't be doing this for the second or third exams because by then you will have taken an exam and you will know what they're like. So it's a one-time thing. You should, if you haven't begun reading the essay by Stephen Wise, I would recommend that you pause or turn off the video right now and go read it. Don't watch this video until you've read the article, or at least the first third of it, because that's about what I'll be covering today. And once you've read it, come back and resume watching my video. And you can follow along by looking at my lecture notes as I go. I'm going to be following my lecture notes pretty closely, and you can do so as well. So let's get started. I propose to cover the introduction today. This is the first of 3 days on WISE, and the introduction has a lot packed in it, and I have a lot of things I want to talk to you about. I want to set up the question that WISE raises and tries to answer in this article. So let's get started. I'm on page 1 of my lecture notes. There's a little paragraph describing Stephen Wise's life and work. I can show you a picture. If we were in the classroom, I would probably pass this around. There's a picture of Stephen Wise. And since the paragraph is fairly short, let's read it together. Excuse me. Stephen M. Wise is founder and president of the Non-Human Rights Project. He has practiced animal protection law for 30 years throughout the U.S. and is the author of 4 books. So I'll just give you the titles without giving you the subtitles. He has a book entitled Rattling the Cage, a book called Drawing the Line, a book called Though the Heavens May Fall, and a book called An American Trilogy, Death, Slavery, and Dominion Along the Banks of the Cape Fear River. So he's a prolific author as well as a practicing attorney. He has a law degree from Boston University Law School, and believe it or not, he has a Bachelor of Science degree in chemistry from the College of William and Mary. So something must have happened between his undergraduate days and his law school days. He made a transition from chemistry to law. But it also shows you that he has a background in science. And he does talk about some scientific and technological matters in this essay that we're about to start. That doesn't mean he's a practicing scientist. I'm not saying that. And I'm not implying that everything he says about science or technology is therefore correct. I mean, even scientists get things wrong. But he does typically know what he's talking about. And when he makes a factual claim of a scientific or technological sort, he usually cites to the source in a footnote. So if you don't believe what he's saying, you can go read the source and check it for yourself. That's another reason to read footnotes. Okay, so let's get started on the introduction. It's 6 pages long. What I want you to know as we go through this are the following. Sometimes WISE analyzes a concept. For example, moral agency. What is a moral agent? WISE tells us. He also discusses things like a telos. He said every living organism has a telos. So I want you to know what a telos is. And I'm going to go over it in my notes when we get to that point. And he also discusses it in the essay. So always pay attention when WISE discusses a concept, when he analyzes a concept, or when he makes a distinction. He may make a distinction between, for example, a moral agent and a mere thing. And so you need to know what is the difference between the two. Secondly, WISE is making an extended argument in this essay, and I want you to know what that argument is. I've already posted a handout in which I set out WISE's argument. I reconstruct his argument to try to display its structure. So you should know his argument inside and out, because I'll surely ask you questions on the exam about his argument. Third, WISE sometimes criticizes other people or other people's arguments. You should always pay attention to that. If he's discussing an argument by Descartes, the philosopher René Descartes, you need to know, first of all, what argument is Descartes making and what exactly does WISE think is wrong with it. So those are the kinds of things you should pay attention to as you read this essay. In fact, when you read any essay, you should read it as a philosopher does. Look for arguments, look for criticisms, look for distinctions, look for analyses of concepts, that sort of thing. All right, Um, in philosophy, the emphasis on the facts is less important, right? Philosophy is not the same as science. They're very different in some ways. Science is about understanding how the world actually is in a profound way. Philosophy is more concerned with arguments and criticisms of arguments and ideas, not so much the facts. Okay, so let's get started just by way of a general introduction. How do humans make use of animals? And by the way, humans are themselves animals. You and I, whatever else we may be, we're animals. So we could distinguish within the class of animals between those that are human and those that are non-human. You may recall when I was discussing Wise and his background, he's the founder and president of the Non-Human Rights Project. So his concern is with the rights of non-human animals, animals such as cows and pigs and dogs, chimpanzees. So to avoid having to say non-human animals all the time, I will probably use the term animals. It's a little bit dangerous to do that because the temptation is to think that there are animals and there are humans, when in fact we are animals. We're not the same as other animals. We may differ from them in our cognitive capacities, but we may be alike. We may be similar to them in other ways. For example, having the capacity to suffer. So I'm going to call non-human animals simply animals from now on, but keep in mind that we are also animals. So how do the human animals make use of the non-human animals? And you can see on my page 1, bleeding over onto page 2 of my lecture notes, I have a number of ways we humans make use of animals. First, we use them for food. Not everybody, of course. I understand that there are people who abstain from eating meat or any animal products. But many or most humans in the past and in the present and probably in the future will have used and will use animals for food. So I'm thinking here of meat, which is the flesh of some animal. Also, organs and bones are consumed in various ways. Organs like lungs or liver, things like that. Also, notice that some animal products are not flesh, they're not meat. I'm thinking of animal products like eggs. They are products that come from animals, but they're not parts of the animals themselves. They're not flesh. Milk comes from animals like cows or goats. And also honey. Honey is made by animals. It's made by bees. And humans certainly use it for food. So one of the main ways humans use animals is for food, for sustenance. Secondly, clothing, or perhaps we should think of it as adornment. I'm thinking here of things like wool, which comes from sheep, fur, leather, silk, which is made by silkworms, feathers, which come from birds, but also jewelry, furniture, and pillows. Some pillows have duck feathers in them or some kind of feathers from birds. Some furniture may be made at least in part from animal products. And jewelry could come from the bones of an animal or the teeth of an animal or something like that. So humans use animals for clothing to protect them from the elements or for adornment, right, to adorn themselves. Third, animals traditionally have been used for work. We put them to work for us. I'm thinking here of oxen who draw or pull wagons, heavy loads, sheepdogs. Notice a lot of these items in my list involve dogs. Dogs are a very interesting case. They have been used by humans to perform certain tasks. Sheepdogs herd sheep. In fact, we call them shepherds for that reason. Draft horses pull plows and other loads. Service animals, dogs mainly, but also other animals, are trained to assist people with disabilities, people who can't see, for example. Hunting dogs, like hounds, have been used to assist in hunting deer or foxes or other animals. Bees are used for honey, beekeepers, we call them. Silkworms are used to produce material for silk. There are police dogs or canine dogs who assist the police in ferreting out crime. There are emergency dogs who, you may have seen images after an earthquake, dogs who are trained to smell human beings are walking on the rubble of some collapsed building, trying to find out whether there are any living humans in there, in the rubble. There are drug sniffing dogs, guard dogs, and I'm sure many more. Some dogs, terriers, were bred to dig into the ground, into the burrows of rabbits or weasels or other animals. They're digging dogs. Terrier comes from the word terra, which means earth. So dogs are amazingly trainable and breedable to perform certain tasks. Okay, moving on. Animals are used for education. You may, in high school or in a college biology class, you may have dissected animals, for example, frogs, to learn about physiology and anatomy. You may have dissected pig fetuses. You may even have done certain things to living animals to learn about them. So that's an educational process. We use animals for entertainment, to entertain ourselves. We use animals in sport, and we use them in various forms of competition. Excuse me. And I have here a list: rodeos, zoos, circuses, bullfights, cockfights, dog fights, dog racing, horse racing, cutting horses, dog shows, rabbit shows. And that's just a partial list of ways we use animals to entertain ourselves or for sport or competition. We use animals for companionship. Think of the many household pets, mainly dogs and cats that people have, but also birds. Many people have birds in cages in their homes, parakeets and parrots and so on. Some people keep reptiles in their home, snakes, turtles, lizards, confined to a cage, and also fish, goldfish and other fish in a tank. But horses can also be companions. Many people who live with horses or who own horses view them as their companions. Excuse me. They provide for them, they ride them, and enjoy their company. Okay, next on the list, animals are used in research and experimentation. Now, this is slightly different from education. We may be learning things when we research using animals or experiment on animals, but the goal is to produce useful knowledge about diseases and things like that. This is called vivisection, by the way. When you dissect a living animal, the name for that is vivisection. V-I-V-I means living or alive. So that's a common way of using animals. And finally, on page 2 of my lecture notes, you can see worship. Animals are used by human beings as part of their religious practices or worship. Some religions or sects use serpents, maybe even rattlesnakes. I've seen images of rattlesnakes being handled. They're very dangerous animals, and sometimes the people handling them in these religious services get bitten and maybe even die or get very ill. Animals have traditionally, sorry about that. Animals have traditionally been used in sacrifices to appease the gods. They're used in rituals of various sorts. Some religions worship cats. I was reading the other day about ancient Egyptians, and the author of what I was reading said cats were worshipped by these Egyptians. They were considered deities. And cows in places like India are considered sacred beings. And so you find cows wandering right on the streets with vehicles and so on. Okay, so that's just a list of some of the uses we humans make of animals. Wise is not concerned with all of these uses. In fact, as I point out here, he's concerned primarily with the first use, the use of animals for food, and to some extent the second, which is the use of animals for clothing or adornment. So if you look at the title of Wise's essay, the title is Of Farm Animals and Justice. So he's concerned about those animals that are farmed for food or perhaps for fur. There are fur farms where animals are bred and raised or reared to produce, and at some point they're slaughtered for the use of their furs or skins or feathers. Okay, let's talk a little bit about animal husbandry. The word husbandry is an old-fashioned term for using animals as a livelihood. I looked it up in my dictionary just to be precise about it, and you can see that the word husbandry means, quote, the care, cultivation, and breeding of crops and animals. So it's not limited to animal farming, but also crop farming. And it connotes care, cultivation. The animal husbandry or husbander cares about the animals, if not for their own sake, at least for the sake of profit. So you want to treat them well, not so much because they matter to you, but because they are the source of your livelihood. So if you abuse or kill your animals, you may lose profit. So animal husbandry connotes the wise and efficient use of animals for human use. The word husbandry also has a secondary meaning, as you can see in my notes, management and conservation of resources. So when you husband something, you are taking good care of it. You're conserving it, perhaps for later use, even for the use of future generations. Okay, another word for husbandry, I suppose, is farming, although that has some slightly different connotations. Wise points out that the average American, and I think he's talking about adults here, the average American ingests or takes in over 600 pounds of animal flesh and animal products per year. So I think he's including not just flesh, such as pork chops or hamburgers, steaks, but also milk, eggs, and honey, animal products generally. Does that surprise you? The average adult consumes 600 pounds per year. According to Wise, Americans in particular ingest about twice the amount of protein needed for health. Now, why did he throw that in, that little tidbit? I think one of the themes of this whole essay is that consuming animals is not just wrong because of the pain and suffering and deprivation that they experience during the raising and killing, but it's wrong because it's unnecessary. And part of what makes it unnecessary is that we don't need to eat as much flesh to sustain ourselves, to provide for our protein needs. We get twice as much protein as we need. So the implication is that we are using animals in greater quantities than we need to or that we should be. He says that over 100 farm animals are slaughtered each second in the U.S. alone. Now, leave aside the world as a whole. Over 100 farm animals are slaughtered each second. And that would include chickens, turkeys, ducks, pigs, cows, goats, sheep, and so forth. Now, I have a note here to ask students, and if in a classroom, I would ask you this question, and maybe someone would raise a hand and respond to it. Do you think that consumption has increased since 1986 when this article was published. Maybe it has decreased. Maybe it's roughly the same. I don't have an answer to this question. I do know that 1986 was, what, 36 years ago? And it seems to me that the percentage of people in society who call themselves vegetarian or vegan, I think it's probably increased somewhat. But then the population has been rising as well. So maybe the total amount of animals killed and consumed is about the same. I don't know what whether the average amount has gone up or down. But I think more and more people are moving to some kind of vegetarianism or even veganism. You may know some people. You may be one. You may be a vegan or a vegetarian. Later, in fact, let me mention it now. I mentioned this on page 3. A famous philosopher named R.M. Hare, Hare, wrote an article many years ago entitled "Why I Am Only a Demi-Vegetarian," DEMI-vegetarian. In fact, I posted his article for you on Canvas, and I made it optional, but you might want to take a look at it. Hare says that he and his wife consume a certain amount of animal products, but they don't eat just any animal. In fact, Hare makes it clear that he and his wife eat mainly fish, and only occasionally some beef or pork, I suppose, but mostly fish. And they don't eat fish every day. It's only on occasion. So would it be correct to call Hare a vegetarian? Probably not, because that word connotes abstention from meat. And Hare admits that he eats fish and occasionally other meats. But he eats them in small quantities and only occasionally. So there needs to be a name for that. And he coined the term demi-vegetarian years ago. So you might want to read his essay. Okay, let's turn now to the topic of factory farms. You may not know this. Maybe you've lived your whole life in the suburbs or in the city rather than in a rural area or on a farm. You may not know that there are really two different ways animals can be raised for food. One of them respects the telos of the animal. And I'll say more about what a telos is in a few minutes, but the telos of the animal is roughly its instinctual life or way of life. It's the way an animal would get on if it weren't artificially confined by humans. So in some farms, the animals are allowed to graze outside in a pasture. Maybe they're allowed to come in at night or during inclement weather, but they're outside in the elements, grazing, eating natural foods like grass. They are allowed to interact with others of their own kind. So more than one cow is in the pasture. They give birth outdoors in a natural way, perhaps with assistance from some human. They have social relations with other animals, that sort of thing. Now, probably most of the meat that is consumed in our society comes from animals who have very different lives from that. Very different. Their lives are spent indoors. Maybe if their whole lives are indoors. They never see the sun. They never feel a breeze. They never eat natural foods like grass. They are fed artificial diets inside an enclosed space. It's like a factory. It's like a meat-producing factory. And this is true not just for cows and pigs, but also for animals like chickens and ducks and geese, turkeys. So I brought in a few images to show you. I typically pass these around in class, but I'll hold them up close to the camera, and you can get an idea of what I'm talking about. These are images I got off Google, and they show how animals are raised in what Wise and others call factory farms. So let me begin with this image. It has two pictures on it, and I'll hold it up close. You see the one on the top? it shows calves in their containers. And you can see that they have bowls in front of them for their food and water. Now, these calves are taken from their mothers immediately upon birth. So the bond between mother and calf is immediately sundered or broken, which, as you can imagine, causes a great deal of frustration and depression and so on. These calves are then put in these narrow containers, and the goal is to produce veal. These calves are meant to be turned into veal at some point. Now, I haven't eaten veal, or if I did, it was many, many decades ago. But I understand that veal is best when it's tender, pink and tender. Well, in order to get the meat pink and tender, you have to minimize the development of muscle. And the way to minimize the development of muscle is to keep the calves from moving around. Calves out in a pasture would prance and jump and play and run, and that would build up the muscles in their legs and thighs and so on. And that would destroy the value of the veal meat that is eventually produced. So the farmers have devised a system whereby the calves can't move. They can't turn around, ever. All they can do is lie down or stand up. That's all they do their whole life. Lie down, stand up. They can't turn around. They can probably smell the calf next to them or the calves around them, but they can't see them, interact with them in any way, nuzzle them, play with them. You can see that the wood up here in front of the calves has been chewed. That's from boredom. The calves chew on the wood. And if it were metal, they would chew on the metal. And another reason they chew on the metal is to get the lead from the paint. Because these calves, meant for veal, they are fed a highly artificial diet designed to fatten them up quickly so that they can be slaughtered and replaced with additional calves. So they're fed a diet of antibiotics to keep them from getting sick. They're fed a liquid diet, completely liquid diet containing nutrients designed to fatten them up, and they're deprived of iron. Again, that's to keep the meat pink and tender, mainly pink, because if calves were fed iron, it would make the meat red, and I guess that's not desirable for people who like veal. So you get the picture. A lot more could be said about it. These calves have horrific lives filled with suffering, deprivation, denial of all of their natural instincts, and so on. Death would actually come as a relief, I would think, for these poor calves. So that's how veal is produced in many farms around the country and around the world. Down below, you can see a modern chicken farm. You can see that's two levels of chickens. They're crammed into cages. The bottom of the cage is made out of wire. And that's so that when the chickens defecate or urinate, it can just go down below and be cleaned out mechanically. Whereas if you had a solid floor, then the excrement would pile up and have to take a lot more work to get in each cage and clean it out. Now, these wires mean the chickens spend their whole life walking on wires with their webbed feet. And you can imagine how painful and annoying that would be and frustrating that would be for the chickens. The chickens are crammed in. These are egg-laying chickens. It's an egg farm. So these chickens are viewed as machines, egg-laying machines. There's no concern whatsoever for their comfort or convenience or pleasure. The fact that they feel pain or any other negative emotion is irrelevant to the farmer. The goal is to produce the most eggs possible in the shortest amount of time to increase profits. Now, chickens, when they're packed together so tightly in a cage, they naturally want to peck each other with their beaks. So one of the things that these chicken farms do is they have to cut the beaks off these chickens early in their life so that when they peck, it doesn't do any damage to the other chickens. So they take a hot piece of metal, someone does, when these chicks are a certain size, they just grab them and they run their beak over this hot metal and it just cuts the beak off. And there's just a little stub left over. And then for the rest of their lives, they can't use their beak to do any damage. When some of these chickens die in their cages, and often they're just left in their cages for days before someone comes along and pulls them out and throws them in the incinerator. And whenever a chicken gets too old to lay eggs at the proper rate, they are taken out and maybe their neck is wrung and they're thrown in the incinerator to be disposed of. So these chickens have horrific lives. And that's why if you go to the grocery store, I'm sure you've noticed on certain egg containers phrases like cage-free eggs or terms like that. Now, I don't know whether you can believe these claims. I don't think that's regulated by law. You can claim that these eggs came from free-range chickens who are not confined to cages, but maybe that just means they have a little bit more room. Maybe they're not packed 3 to a cage, but maybe they're not packed 6 to a cage, but only 3 to a cage. So you need to be careful and be skeptical when you see these claims made on these egg containers. Are the chickens really allowed to move about freely in a yard, picking in the dirt, where their beaks are not cut off, and so on? Do they have lives involving some amount of pleasure or sociality where they can associate with other chickens? Okay, those are 2 images. Here are 2 more. At the top image, you can see it looks like popcorn, but those are living chicks. These male chicks are useless to the egg company. So these chicks come down the conveyor belt, somebody or some people identify the chicks by their sex, either male or female. The male chicks are thrown in this bag, alive. And when that bag gets full, it's either picked up by a machine or by humans, and it's thrown in an incinerator. So imagine, you can see how big that bag is. The chicks at the bottom of that bag are suffocating or perhaps smashed to death already. And the ones on the top will be dead very shortly when that whole bag is thrown into an incinerator. So the goal is to get rid of the male chicks in the most efficient way. And that's the way they do it in certain egg farms. And finally, at the bottom, you'll see a man. You'll see some geese all huddled up in the corner. That man is taking them one at a time, and he has a machine that he opens their mouth, and he puts that device in their mouth, and it forces food into the throat of the goose in a quantity far greater than the goose would actually eat. The goal of that process is to create what's called pâté de foie gras. It's paste of goose liver. So that forced feeding of the geese is designed to expand the size of their livers. And when they're killed, eventually, they have large livers, larger than they would otherwise have. And those livers are then made into a fine paste, which is considered a delicacy. It's called pâté de foie gras. So I'm sure Wise would say, if you want to do anything to alleviate the suffering of animals, you might abstain from eating pâté de foie gras, veal, right? Maybe you'll eat other meats, but you could abstain from eating veal. If there's a veal cutlet on the menu, you could say, no, I don't eat veal. Okay, so those are some images that I gleaned from the internet showing modern factory farm techniques. That's what Wise is talking about in this essay. He's not talking about animals that are allowed to graze in the pasture, live natural lives, have social relations with other animals of the same kind, and so forth. So we're going to focus from now on factory farmed animals. And Wise's goal in this essay is to make an argument, and the conclusion of his argument is that factory farms should be abolished, not just reformed or changed, but gotten rid of. Abolish means get rid of. He's in favor of abolition. You may recall in the pre-Civil War days, there were abolitionists. They wanted to get rid of the institution of slavery, human chattel slavery. They didn't want just to reform the institution and get rid of some of its more abusive and oppressive features. They wanted to get rid of it altogether. And that's what Wise wants to do. You can't reform something as evil and harmful as slavery. And according to Wise, you can't and shouldn't try to reform something as evil and oppressive and harmful as factory farming. We need to work to get rid of it. Now, that doesn't mean he's against those other kinds of farms where animals are allowed to range freely and live more natural lives. Okay, Wise might advocate that those should be abolished as well, those kinds of farms. But in this article, that's not his focus. Okay, keep that in mind. He's taking it one step at a time. In this article, let's go after factory farms. Here's what he says on pages 191 and 193. First, 191. Most farm animals live out their lives in places that little resemble a traditional farm, but in a kind of factory where they stand crowded on artificial ground and see only the light and feel only the warmth of artificial suns. That would be the floodlights in the building. Second quotation from 193. Wise says, on the factory farm, individual animals are frequently seen as unimportant. That goose right there, okay? That particular goose, and that one, and that one. Individual animals are not seen as important. Right? The animal is viewed as a species or as a collectivity, a group of animals. Now, I don't know about you, but I wouldn't want to be viewed in that way. I'm an individual. I have my own needs, my own interests. My pain matters most to me because I feel it directly. It doesn't mean I don't care about other people's pain, but my pain is direct and immediate, and I have a special concern to prevent myself from feeling pain or being made to experience pain. So, back to Wise. On the factory farm, individual animals are frequently seen as unimportant. Their interests and concerns are subordinated to those of the herd or flock, and ultimately to those of man. So, many animals today, perhaps most of those used for food, live their lives in what we would have to call a factory, not in a pasture or other natural setting. Profitability is the key. The goal is to maximize profit for the producer. And I have a note to myself to circulate the images that I just showed you. Now, Wise risks offending people when he compares the treatment of farm animals to slavery and genocide. And I have a note, if you look at his page 193, notes 6 and 8, and also pages 197 bleeding over to 198, you can see Wise draws an analogy to human slavery and genocide. Almost every human is appalled by human slavery and genocide. Not everyone is appalled by the way animals are treated. Wise is, and other people are. In terms of the sheer quantity of individuals who are slaughtered, who are made to live lives of pain and suffering and deprivation, the numbers exceed the number of humans enslaved or killed in a genocide. So just in terms of numbers, they're greater in the case of farm animals. And maybe in terms of the overall amount of suffering, Maybe that's greater for farm animals. So make what you will of it, but Wise is saying if you're concerned about human slavery and genocide, and he assumes that you are, you should be just as concerned about what is happening to animals on these factory farms. The suffering is incredible. The deprivation is incredible. Many people don't even know the facts about how their hamburgers are prepared. When you go into a grocery store, go over to the meat section, everything is clean and packed in cellophane. Right? It has a beautiful pink shine to it. The hamburger, the chicken breasts, the pork chops, and so on. How many people, when they're shopping in a store, have no idea where that meat came from? I mean, they may vaguely, if they think about it, think, yeah, it came from animals. But do they know the circumstances in which it was produced? Do they know anything about the lives that those animals lived? The amount of pain that they experienced, the frustration, the deprivation, the suffering? Probably not. They probably know nothing about it. And so they purchase these products with a clear conscience, take them home, cook them and eat them and enjoy them. Wise, I think, would advocate that people learn more about how hamburger is produced, how pork chops are produced, and so on. And some of them might be so disgusted or horrified that they change their dietary habits altogether. I told you earlier that I would talk about this concept of a telos. Let's turn to page 194. I've got my article here. I'm going to turn to page 194 of Wise and read just a little bit of what he says about a telos. He says near the bottom of the text on 194, the act of concentrating farm animals in a way that fails to respect their ethological needs, and as an example, look at the chickens and the calves. Those processes fail to respect the ethological needs of those animals. Their telos is being violated or disrespected. Concentrating animals in this way causes them to suffer mental and physiological stresses and renders them weak and further susceptible to disease. Now look at footnote 15 on that page. Wise says, when an animal is alive, quote, it has what Aristotle called a telos, a nature, a function, a set of activities intrinsic to it, evolutionarily determined and genetically imprinted. Furthermore, its life consists precisely in a struggle to perform these functions, to actualize this nature, to fulfill these needs, to maintain this life. So each of those chickens who's confined to a cage with several other chickens, each one has a natural urge to spread its wings. It can't do it because it's confined to this cage. So that urge is frustrated. These chickens have other urges, an urge to peck in the dirt for insects, but they can't. They're fed on a conveyor belt, a certain sort of food that is designed to make them produce eggs more quickly than usual and with harder shells. And one way to do that is to feed them ground up oyster shells. Now, in nature, in a natural setting, chickens don't eat oyster shells. By feeding chickens ground up oyster shells, they thereby produce eggs with thicker shells, harder shells, and that's important to the egg producer because if an egg breaks at any point in the process, it's useless. It can't be sold. How many times have you purchased eggs and before putting a carton of eggs into your cart, you open it up and look? Sometimes when you look, you'll see one or more eggs has a crack in it. And you may decide, I don't want that dozen eggs, I'll get another one. So a cracked egg is unsellable. And that whole dozen eggs may have to be thrown away because there's one cracked egg in it. So these chickens are fed all kinds of artificial ingredients to make them produce more eggs with harder shells. So their telos is being violated in all of these ways. And the same is true of those calves that I showed you, the geese that I showed you, and lots of other animals. Cattle in feedlots, even if they're outside, they're crammed together with hundreds of other cows. They are walking knee deep in their own excrement. They're covered in excrement and mud, and they're waiting, simply waiting for food to be brought to them. There's no grazing, there's nothing, no grass for them to eat. So they just stand around in their own excrement day after day, waiting for the daily food to be brought to them. And the goal of that food is to fatten them up as quickly as possible for slaughter. So keep this concept of telos in mind, and there will certainly be questions on the exam designed to see whether you understand it. Now, what happens when you fail to respect the telos of an animal? Well, as Wise just pointed out, they suffer from stress, right? The frustration of a chicken not being able to spread its wings, for example. The stress produces weakness and disease. So these animals, cattle in feedlots, chicken in their cages, veal calves in their stalls, they are threatened with various diseases. And that, of course, is anathema to the producer, because diseased animals sometimes have to be put to death, and their flesh or eggs can't be used, can't be sold. So the producer of these animals has to ensure that they don't contract diseases, that they don't get sick. And how do you do that? You pump them up with antibiotics to keep them from getting sick. And that itself has all kinds of negative consequences, including for humans. The overuse of antibiotics decreases their effectiveness, not just for the animals, but for human beings. So we've got this whole industry of pumping up animals with antibiotics, and it's a real cesspool in terms of the harm that it does to the animals themselves and even to humans. So ultimately, it's the profit motive that's driving this whole thing. Anything that conduces to greater profit will be done to these animals in terms of how they're confined, what they're fed, what sorts of drugs are administered to them, and so forth. There's no concern for the amount of suffering or deprivation inflicted. These animals are viewed as things. They're viewed as machines for the production of flesh or eggs. All right. Wise points out in passing that meat is actually unhealthy. And you must wonder, why did he put that in? I think his point, to be charitable to him, is that meat is not only not necessary for a healthy, active life, but it can actually be detrimental. So he's trying to head off the argument that humans need meat, that humans who don't consume meat or other animal products will grow weak and frail, and they'll be unable to exert and accomplish things that are physically demanding. Now, I think studies are pretty clear in showing that that's false. There was a cycling team, a professional cycling team, made up of vegetarians, maybe even vegans, I can't remember. And they were competitive. I've read stories about marathon runners or other ultra runners who were at the very top of their field, and they were vegetarians or even vegans. So study, and you can look these up for yourself. I think studies have refuted the idea that you need meat in order to be strong and vigorous and healthy and active and productive. That's false. I know vegans and vegetarians myself, and many of them are quite vigorous and strong. So what is Wise's objective in this essay? And I'm almost done for the day. We're approaching 1 hour. Let's look at page 196. In fact, I'd like to read the final paragraph of this section, because in this paragraph, Wise tells you where he's going and what he's going to be doing in the rest of the article. Here's what he says. In this article, the unjust state of present law as it concerns farm animals and the homocentricity that underlies it is examined and criticized. So notice, Wise is a lawyer. He's concerned with the legal status of animals. He's concerned with the way the law treats these animals. And in the end, he wants to change the law so that animals have greater protections. He even goes so far as to say that the way the law currently treats animals is unjust. It's an injustice. It's a grave wrong to the animals, the way they're treated and the way the law treats them. The word homocentricity should have been replaced with anthropocentricity or anthropocentricity. It means the same thing. Homo and anthropo both mean humans. And what it means is human-centered. He's saying that the law, as it exists, is human-centered. It puts humans on a pedestal, and it ignores the legitimate interests of non-human animals. And Wise wants to change that. Okay, let's continue. Some of the erroneous ways in which society thinks about farm animals, indeed animals in general, the ways in which the law drives this thinking, and the ways in which this thinking drives the law are discussed. Integrated are proposals that would encourage the protection of the health and welfare of farm animals. Other proposals would encourage public awareness of the conditions under which farm animals live and die, of the waste, pollution, and inefficiency that is factory farming's twin, and of the harmful effects of factory farming upon the health of human beings. The hope, Wise's hope, is that presentation of the facts will permit an informed public to decide whether the factory farming system is just, whether it wishes to support the factory farm system by purchasing its products, or even whether it should call for its reform or abolition. Finally, the proposals would discourage factory farming and the use of biotechnology that reduces the animal to an object, and encourage the return to and renewed growth of a humane and caring system of farm animal husbandry. So that last sentence shows you that Wise seems to be open to allowing animal husbandry of a different sort, not the factory farm type where the animals live like this, but a more humane type of farming where animals live natural lives or more natural and are not subjected to various types of suffering and deprivation. One of the items that I posted on Canvas for you already, it's optional reading, but I think you should read it and will enjoy it. It's an article by Michael Pollan. It's published in the New York Times Magazine about 2 decades ago, and the title is An Animal's Place. And Pollan went out for research prior to writing this article. He visited some of these so-called humane farms, and he describes them. He talked to the owner. He walked around. He was allowed to look around on the farm and see how the animals lived and how they were killed. They were eventually killed for use of their flesh for meat. The goal was to give these animals good lives and then kill them quickly and painlessly, and then replace them with other equally happy animals. So that's the kind of farm that Wise has in mind when he says, let's abolish factory farms and replace them, at least initially, with these humane farms. Maybe eventually we can get rid of those so-called humane farms as well. and stop using animals for food altogether. Now, that may be way off in the future. That may be a pipe dream. So I think Wise's immediate focus, his urgent focus, is to do whatever he can to end factory farms, because that's where the terrible suffering and deprivation take place. One more thing before we part. It has been said by others that there are multiple independent reasons for someone to be a vegetarian or vegan. There's not just one reason to be a vegetarian. There actually are quite a few, any one of which would suffice for someone to abstain from meat or from animal products. Let me just list a few. Now, I'm not going to support these or make the argument. I'm just going to canvass the various alternatives. First of all, if you care only for yourself, if you care literally about nothing or no one else, no other humans at all, no animals at all, if you don't care about the environment, if you don't care about anything but you should be a vegetarian. And that's because of the bad health effects of eating meat. The link to colon cancer and various other forms of cancer or heart disease. Look at some of the studies that have been done showing a link between the consumption of meat and various diseases. Okay, so I'm not going to go into the details of the argument, but it has been argued that if you care about no one or nothing but yourself, you should be a vegetarian because it's in your interest. It's for your own good. Secondly, suppose you care only about your family and friends. You love them. You want what's best for them. Again, you should encourage them to be a vegetarian, and you should yourself be a vegetarian because your family and friends depend on you. And if you consume meat and die prematurely, you are harming your family and friends, your dependents. So if you have duties to other people, such as your family and friends, then you should abstain from meat out of respect for them. Third, if you care about people generally, human beings generally, even if you don't care about animals at all, you should be a vegetarian, or so it has been argued. And that's because the process of producing meat is very inefficient. Peter Singer has recently said, and I think Wise talks about this to some extent, it takes a lot of it takes a lot of plant protein to produce a little bit of animal protein. So the steak that you eat, yes, contains protein, but the amount of plant protein that went into the production of that steak was 10 times greater. That protein from the plants could have been used to feed humans who are malnourished throughout the world. There are people all over the world who get inadequate protein every day, and that creates certain diseases and illnesses for them. If we stopped eating animals and stopped feeding them the plant protein that we currently do, there would be lots of plant protein left to provide for the humans and to make their lives better. So if all you cared about is other humans like yourself, you should advocate and practice vegetarianism. You see the argument? Fourth, if you care about the animals themselves, you will become a vegetarian. That's pretty straightforward. If you abstain from meat, then there will be no animals who are raised and killed for you on your account. And finally, if you care about the environment, if you're an environmentalist, you should be a vegetarian. And that's because these factory farms produce tremendous amounts of waste. There are on cattle feedlots, there are lagoons filled with excrement. The cows themselves, while they're alive, produce methane gas, which, as you know, contributes to the problem of global warming. If we shut down the feedlots, that would be less damage to the environment. There are also on pig farms, there are lagoons filled with waste that pollute the groundwater. The smell alone is a negative byproduct. Neighbors sometimes sue pig farms because of the horrible smell. It makes people sick. The smell is so intense. People a mile away can smell the fumes of the pig farm, and sometimes they sue to shut down the pig farm. What else? So these farms, these factory farms, have a lot of negative consequences for the environment. When these chickens are incinerated, that will produce smoke, I assume, which contributes again to pollution and global warming and so on. So if all you cared about was the environment, the natural world, you should be a vegetarian. Stop contributing to the problem. Now, at this point, you may be wondering, is it within my power as an individual to make a difference? Many people wonder about that. Suppose I became a vegetarian or even a vegan today and stayed that way the rest of my life. How many animal lives would I have saved? Maybe only a few, only a couple of cows and a few pigs or chickens would be alive who were, if I abstained from meat. And you may think that really is not much of a difference. But maybe you shouldn't think of it that way. You shouldn't think of it as, what will happen if I give up meat? I think many vegetarians and vegans look at it a different way. They say, do I want to be part of the problem or part of the solution? There are people who care, there are people who care about their own personal integrity. I don't want to be the sort of person, they say, who contributes to suffering and death and deprivation of animals. So by abstaining from eating their flesh, I know for a fact that I'm not contributing to it. Now, some people go further than abstaining from meat. Some people refuse to wear leather products, belts, or leather shoes, because those also come from slaughtered animals. Some people refuse to wear furs. They might choose to wear faux fur or fake fur. Anyway, the idea is that I want to live a life of authenticity. I want to live a life of integrity where I'm living in accordance with my own moral principles. I want to be the sort of person who goes through life not adding to the suffering of others. In fact, I want to work hard to alleviate suffering and deprivation to the extent that I can in my life. I want to have clean hands, right? I don't want my hands to get dirtied by participating in an institution such as factory farming that I view to be unjust. So it's a matter more of not so much making a causal difference to how the world is, but living a life of integrity and purity, maybe, or cleanliness. Right? I'm not part of the problem. Other people are part of the problem. I'm not, and I want to be, if anything, part of the solution of that problem. So you can say, for example, no animal has suffered or died on my account because of me. And if you live your whole life in this way, you can die happy or contented that during your life you made decisions that did not contribute to the amount of suffering in the world, and perhaps you went further than that and actually made decisions that promoted happiness and pleasure and contentment for others, humans and animals. So let's leave it there. We've set up the topic nicely, I think, and we have 2 more days on WISE, which will take us up to the exam. So on Wednesday this week, I will record my second lecture, and I will post it for Thursday's class. Again, I'll be in class on Thursday, but I won't be lecturing. One thing I refuse to do is to do the same lecture twice. And if the university is going to make me lecture for even one student, record a lecture for even one student, then that's going to be the lecture that I record for everyone. But again, that's all going to end on the 1st of March. So bear with me. This student will be back in the classroom, I'm sure, on the 1st of March. And we'll have a normal semester after that. So by the time you watch my second video this week, you should have read the whole essay. And I propose to cover, most of section 2, which is entitled Inadequacies of Present Law. That section starts on page 197. Okay, so I'm going to get started on 197 for the second lecture. Okay, we're an hour and 11 minutes in. Have a wonderful day. I'll send an email once I get this posted in probably a couple of hours. It takes a while to get it uploaded to YouTube, and then I have to go in and copy and paste the URL to Canvas and then write the email. And I have some things to do in the meantime. So I'll get this up a little bit later today. So have a great day and a great tomorrow, and I'll see you on the computer screen again on Wednesday.